The third week of frost had hardened the lane outside the music shop in Nethercote when the bell above the door rang, and Esme Rayburn looked up from a ledger she had been afraid to close. A gentleman stood in the doorway with rain still bright on the shoulders of his navy coat, and he did not announce himself, and he did not remove his gloves, and for a long moment he only looked at the room as though he were counting it. She knew him by sight, the way the whole village knew him, the Earl of Caldbeck who had buried his mother that autumn and had not been seen at church since. She had expected a footman. She had expected the bailiff. She had not expected the man whose name was printed at the top of every notice of debt that had been nailed to her shutters that month. He asked whether she was Miss Rayburn, the daughter of the late Mr. Ringan. Rayburn, who had kept the subscription library in the music copying, and she said that she was, and her voice did not shake, and she was proud of that even as her heart climbed into her throat and beat there where she could feel it. He set a folded paper on the counter. Between them he told her the amount her father had owed at his death. Said it plainly. £412, the figure she had carried in her own chest like a swallowed coal since January. Then he told her it was settled. Every note, every account at the print works in the county town, the back rent, the debt to the instrument maker who had repossessed her father's 2 best violins in March. She did not thank him. She could not. For the simple reason that she did not understand him, and a woman raised by a careful man does not thank what she cannot understand. She asked him why. He looked at her with eyes the color of wet slate, and something moved behind them, and was gone. And he said only that her father had once done his family a service, and that the family discharged its debts. Then he put on his hat, and he was at the door before she found the word she wanted, which was not thank you, and was not why, but was absurdly, wait. He did not wait. The bell rang again. The frost held the lane, and Esme stood alone with a paper that unmade her ruin and could not for her life say what it cost. To the village of Nethercote, Esme Rayburn had been decided long before that morning, and the village's verdict on her was settled and gentle and entirely wrong. She was the shopkeeper's orphan, the clever girl who copied music in a hand so fine, the county families paid extra for it, the spinster of 26 who had nursed her father through 2 winters of failing lungs and had nothing now but a lease, a counter, and a debt. They pitied her without unkindness. They had decided she was a sad, small thing the world had passed by, and they were sorry for it, and they were wrong about the smallness, and they were wrong about the passing by, though it would be a season before any of them learned how wrong. Her father had come to Nethercote when she was 4 years old, a widower with a child, and a trunk of music, and no history he would speak of. He had taught her to read a score before she could read a psalter. He had taught her that a copyist's hand must never betray fatigue, that a rest is as exact as a note, that the silence in music is written and not merely left. He had taught her everything, except where she had come from, and when she had asked, as a child asks, he had grown so still and so gray that she had learned not to ask. She had a single object of her mother that was not a memory, a small enamel locket with a sprig of forget-me-not painted on the lid, and inside it a curl of dark hair and no portrait at all. She wore it under her collar where the village could not see. She wore it the morning the Earl came, and her hand had risen to it without her leave when he said the word, family. Here is a thing worth staying for because the whole of what followed turned on it. A debt paid is not a kindness given. A debt paid is a question asked. And the question the Earl of Caldbeck had laid on her counter, wrapped in £412 and a single cold courtesy, was a question she did not yet know how to read, though she would spend the winter learning. He had not paid it lightly, and he had not paid it for the reason he gave. The Earl of Caldbeck did nothing lightly. He was 34, and he had been an earl for 3 years, and a grieving man for 1. And the village that pitied Esme was a little afraid of him, without quite knowing why. They called him the Stone Earl behind their hands on account of his silences and his black gloves, and the way he rode the boundary of his land at dawn as though he were keeping watch on something that had already happened. What the village did not know, what Esme did not know, what only the Earl and one old solicitor in the county town knew, was the contents of a letter found in his mother's writing desk the week she died. The letter named a man. The man's name was not Rayburn. She learned his face by degrees over the weeks that followed, because once the debt was paid, he did not vanish as a gentleman ought. He came back. He came on a Tuesday to ask whether the instrument maker had returned her father's violins, and when she said the man had sold one already, he was gone before she could finish the sentence, and the next Tuesday the better of the two violins stood on her counter in its case with the bow re-haired. He came on a Thursday to subscribe to her library, which no Earl had any need to do, and chose 4 volumes of sermons he plainly never opened, and one slim book of Italian songs that he carried out under his arm with a care that the sermons did not receive. He never stayed above a quarter of an hour. He never sat. He asked his short questions and received her short answers and left, and the village began to talk, and the talk found its way, as talk does, up the long avenue of limes to Caldbeck Hall and into the morning room of the Dowager Countess. The Dowager Countess of Caldbeck was the Earl's aunt by marriage, the widow of his late father's brother, and she had governed the hall in all but name, through the years of the old Earl's decline and the new Earl's grief. Her name was Lady Sabrina, and she was a handsome woman of 60, who had spent 40 of those years certain that the order of the world was a kindness, and that her place near the top of it was a duty she performed for everyone's good. She was not cruel, as the village understood cruelty. She was something more durable than cruel. She was confident, and her confidence had been correct everywhere she had ever stood, and so she did not recognize it as anything but truth. She summoned her nephew to the morning room on a gray afternoon, and put the matter to him over the tea she poured with her own hands, which was a kindness and a leash at once. She had heard, she said, that he had grown charitable toward a shop girl in the village. She used the word with a small smile, as one uses a word one has chosen carefully and intends to use again. A shop girl. He stood at the window with his back to her, and said that he had settled a debt owed to an honest man's memory. And the dowager set down the pot, and said, in the tone of one teaching a child a thing he ought already to know, that there was no such thing as a debt to a shopkeeper's memory, only an appetite a wise man did not feed. He did not answer. She watched the line of his shoulders, and was satisfied, for she had handled men of every temper for 40 years, and a man who did not argue was a man who had heard. She was wrong about that, but she had no way of knowing it yet, and her error was the kind that compounds. What the dowager wanted, beneath the tea and the warnings, was a marriage. She had a candidate. Lady Romilly Vauncey was the daughter of a marquess and the possessor of £30,000, and a profile that did very well in candlelight, and she had been brought down to a neighbor's house for the winter shooting with an understanding so general that no one had needed to speak it. Lady Romilly had been told her whole life that she was the correct choice for a man of the Earl's rank, and she believed it, without vanity, the way one believes the sun rises in the east, and she found the Earl's silences interesting rather than forbidding. Because she had never in her life been refused anything she had decided to want, she had decided to want Caldbeck. The dowager had decided it for her, and the two decisions had met and married long before the Earl was consulted. Esme knew none of this. She knew only that the Stone Earl had begun to come on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and that she had begun, against every instruction her careful father had ever given her, to listen for the bell. She was angry at herself for it. She told herself the truth she could prove, which was that she owed this man £412 of gratitude she could never repay, and that gratitude wears the costume of fondness so well that a sensible woman must search its pockets. She searched. She found beneath the gratitude something with no debt attached to it at all, and it frightened her more than the bailiff ever had. The first time the wall between them so much as cracked was over a measure of music. He had brought back the book of Italian songs, claiming a fault in the copying, which there was not, and when she opened it to the page, he indicated she saw that he had not marked an error, but had pressed, between the leaves, a single sprig of dried rosemary. She looked at it, and did not touch it. He said, his voice low, that his mother had grown it along the south wall of the hall, and that the song on that page had been one she sang, and that he could no longer bear to hear it played at the hall, and yet could not bear that it should never be played at all. It was the longest speech she had ever had from him. She understood then that the stone Earl was not stone but ice, and that ice is only water that has been hurt by cold, and that under it, the river was still moving. She played the song for him very softly with the shop door bolted and the afternoon going blue at the windows, and when she finished he was looking at the floor, and his jaw was set like a thing carved. And he thanked her and left without another word, and she stood with her hands still on the keys and understood that she was in serious danger. The danger had a witness, Mrs. Sowerby, who kept the Chandlers 2 doors down and had buried 3 husbands and missed nothing, had seen the Earl's horse at Esme's door more Tuesdays than a charitable man's horse had any business being there, and she said so to Esme over the mending one evening, not unkindly, with the air of a woman laying down a card she has held too long. She told Esme plainly what the village had begun to say, that the Earl of Caldbeck was making a convenience of the shopkeeper's daughter, that no good came to a girl who let a great man's horse stand at her door, that she would be the talk of the assembly rooms before Candlemas, and the wife of no one ever. It was said low and kindly. 2 women over a candle, and it landed harder for being kind. Esme thanked her, and did not defend herself, because she could not defend a thing she did not understand, and she went up to her cold room, and took out the enamel locket, and held it, and asked her dead mother a question, that received, as always, no answer at all. The Earl had a question of his own, and his was nearer to an answer than hers, and the answer was killing him by inches. The letter from his mother's desk had named a man. The man was a magistrate, dead these many years, named Sir Halford Mercer. And what the letter said of him was this. 30 years before, when the Earl's mother had been a girl with an inheritance of her own and no title to protect it, Sir Halford Mercer had sat in judgment on a disputed will and had ruled against her, and the ruling had stripped her of a fortune that ought to have been hers, and had handed it to a cousin who had paid for the verdict in coin. The letter named the bribe. It named the sum. It said that the magistrate had ruined her, not from malice, but from greed, and that she had carried the wound of it for 40 years, and that she forgave him in the hope that her son would not have to. And in the last line, in a hand grown unsteady, the letter said one thing more. It said that Sir Halford Mercer had got a daughter on a woman he never married, and had sent the child away to be raised under a false name by a quiet man who took the magistrate's money to do it, and that the child was alive, and that the mother had learned before she died the name the child had been given. The name was Rayburn. The Earl had paid Esme's debts before he understood what he had read. He had gone to the village meaning to look once at the daughter of the man who had broken his mother, meaning to satisfy a cold curiosity, and then never go again. And he had found a woman copying music in a freezing shop with a steadiness that had stopped the breath in his chest. And he had paid £412 rather than say a single word of what he knew. He told himself it was justice, a debt the Mercer line owed his mother's line repaid backward to the innocent party. He told himself it was nothing. He went back on Tuesdays and told himself it was nothing every Tuesday, and the nothing grew until it was the only thing in his life with any warmth in it, and he hated himself for the warmth, because the warmth was for the daughter of the man who had destroyed his mother, and the daughter did not know whose daughter she was, and he did. That was the thing he carried up the avenue of limes each evening. Not stone. A secret with her name in it. The winter deepened. The dowager pressed her advantage. She gave a dinner at the Hall a fortnight before Christmas, a proper county dinner with a Vaughancy party and the better families for 30 miles, and she contrived, with a skill that looked like accident, to have it understood that an announcement might be made before the new year. Lady Romilly wore diamonds that had been her grandmother's, and sat at the Earl's right hand and spoke to him of the hunt and the season and the improvements a great house wanted, and she was not unkind and she was not stupid, and she saw across the candlelight and the silver that the Earl's attention was somewhere else entirely. She was not accustomed to competing with an absence. It piqued her. She began that evening to ask questions, and Lady Romilly Vaughancy asked questions the way a hawk circles, high and patient, and certain of the field. She learned the shopgirl's name within the week. She learned it from the dowager, who gave it to her as a general gives a junior officer the position of the enemy. And the two women understood each other perfectly, without a single coarse word passing between them. A debt had been paid. A horse had stood too often at a door. A man of rank, grieving and therefore foolish, had let himself be made a sentimental charity. It would pass, the dowager said, as such things passed, if it were managed. And to manage a thing, one must first measure it. The dowager decided to measure it in person. She came to the shop on the last Thursday before Christmas, in her own carriage, with the Colbeck Arms on the door, and she came when the Earl was known to be in the county town on business, and she came to a place no countess had ever entered in living memory, and the whole lane stopped to watch the footman hand her down. She did not buy music. She stood in the small warm room, and looked at it the way her nephew had looked at it on the first morning, counting it, finding it wanting, and she addressed Esme with a courtesy so polished it could have cut glass. She said she had come to do the girl a kindness, woman to woman. She said that a connection between a person of the Earl's station and a person of Esme's could end only in the girl's ruin, that the Earl was a gentleman and would not say the cruel thing himself, and that she, the dowager, had come to say it for him so that no one's time should be wasted. She named the figure of Lady Romilly's fortune. She named the date by which the Earl would be engaged. She did all of it without raising her voice, and she watched Esme's face for the collapse she had come to witness. Esme did not collapse. She had been raised by a man who taught her that the silence in music is written. She let the silence sit. Then she said quite clearly that she had not asked the Earl for anything, that the debt had been paid without her solicitation, and that she would return every shilling of it from the labor of her own hands before she would let it be said she had traded on it, though it took her 10 years. She said she wished Lady Romilly very happy. She did not say the other thing, the true thing, which was that she had fallen in love with a man she could not have, and had known it for a month, and had told no one, and would tell no one, least of all this woman. She kept that written silence. And the dowager who had come to measure a sentimental shopgirl, and had found instead a woman with a spine of tempered steel, was for the first time in 40 years not entirely certain she had measured the field correctly. It was a small uncertainty. She crushed it. She left a calling card she knew would not be returned, and went back up the avenue of limes, and that small, crushed uncertainty was the first crack in a wall she did not know was a wall. You may think you know where this is going. Stay with it, because the floor is about to give way under the both of them. The Earl learned of his aunt's visit from Mrs. Jass Sowerby, who told him on the road with her chin up and her 3 dead husbands behind her, because she had decided he was either a scoundrel or a fool, and meant to find out which. He rode to the shop that same hour. He found Esme at her counter, copying, her hands steady, her face composed, and he asked her what his aunt had said, and Esme, who had endured the dowager without a tremor, found that she could not endure him. She told him all of it, the fortune, and the date, and the kindness woman to woman, and then she did the thing she had sworn she would not do, the thing her father had warned her against, the thing that a sensible woman searches her own pockets to avoid. She asked him whether it was true, whether he was to be engaged, whether she had been a charity. And the Earl of Calbeck, who had a level voice for every occasion, who had answered the bailiff and the solicitor and the dowager without his voice once breaking, opened his mouth to tell her that she was no charity, that she was the only warm thing in a cold year, that he would no more marry Romilly Vauncey than he would marry the frost. And he found that he could not say any of it without saying the rest. He could not claim her without telling her whose daughter she was. He could not offer her his name without laying at her feet the name of the man who had broken his mother, and the knowledge that he had known it from the first morning, and had said nothing, and had let her play his mother's song in the dark, not knowing that her own father's hand had reached across 30 years to do the breaking. He stood in the warm shop with the answer in his mouth and could not give it, and the not giving showed in his face. And Esme, who read silences for her living, read this one, and went white. She thought it was a refusal. How could she have thought anything else? She had asked a great man plainly whether she was a convenience, and he had stood mute, and the muteness was an answer, in any language. She gathered herself. She thanked him the words like stones for all his kindness to her father's memory. She told him she would repay the debt by quarterly installments, and would trouble him no further. She asked him, with a courtesy as polished as his aunt's, to take his subscription elsewhere. And the Earl, drowning in a truth he could not speak, bowed and left, because the only other thing he could do was tell her, and he had decided, in the worst decision of his life, that the truth would wound her past healing, and that a clean refusal she could survive, and the truth she could not. He rode home through the dark, and hated his own cowardice and called it mercy, which is the lie cowardice tells in a gentleman's voice. The bell did not ring on Tuesday. It did not ring on Thursday. Esme copied music in a hand that did not betray fatigue, and took down the better violin, and could not bear to play it, and put it away, and wore the locket under her collar, and did not weep where Mrs. May. Sowerby could see, and the village, which had decided she was a sad, small thing the world had passed by, congratulated itself on having been right all along. This was the dark of the year, and the worst of it had not yet come, and it would have to deepen before it could turn. It deepened on a Sunday. It deepened because Lady Romilly Vauncey, who circled high and patient and certain of the field, had not been idle. Piqued by an absence, she had set her own woman to learn what the absence was made of, and her own woman, in a county town that loved a secret, had found the old solicitor's clerk, and the clerk, in his cups, had let fall that there was a letter, and a name, and a daughter, and a magistrate long dead named Mercer. Lady Romilly was not a fool. She assembled it the way she assembled a winning hand, and she saw at once that the shop girl was no charity at all, but a complication with a history. And she saw with the clear, cold sight of a woman who has never been refused, how that history might be turned to clear the field. She did not want the Earl's heart. She wanted the match. And a match is cleared, not by winning a man's heart, but by making the rival impossible. She took the story to the dowager. The two women, the one who protected the order of the world, and the one who had never been told no, made a plan that was not cruel, as the village understood cruelty, but was something more durable, and they chose their arena with care. They chose the Caldbeck 12th Night Ball, where the county would be gathered, where the Earl would be present, where the hierarchy that had pitied Esme could be assembled to render its verdict in a single evening. They sent the shop girl an invitation. They wanted her there. A trap wants its quarry in the room. Esme nearly did not go. She had no business at a great house's ball, and knew it, and the invitation in the dowager's own hand smelled of a thing she could not name. Mrs. Sowerby, three husbands wise, turned the card over and said that a card sent in spite is a card sent by someone who is afraid, and that a woman who has done no wrong should never decline to stand in a lit room, and that she would lend Esme her own grandmother's lace and dress her hair herself. So Esme went. She wore her best gown, which was a plain soft green, and Mrs. Sowerby's lace at the throat, and under the lace, where no one could see, the enamel locket with the painted forget-me-not. She went into the saturated gold of the Caldbeck ballroom, into the diamonds and the candle fire, and the music played by people she had taught, a plain green figure among the saturated room, and she held her chin as her father had taught her, and she waited to learn what she had been brought there to suffer. She did not wait long. The dowager had staged it like a play. At the turn of the evening, when the dancing paused and the room was full and the Earl stood near the great fireplace with Lady Romilly Bright at his side, the dowager raised her voice in the pleasant carrying tone of a hostess making a remark, and she said, so that the nearest 40 people heard it, and the farther 40 leaned to hear, that it was a curious thing to see the daughter of Sir Halford Mercer standing in the Caldbeck ballroom. Of all the rooms in England, she let it land. Then she told them why it was curious. She told the room in her pleasant voice the whole of it, the bribed verdict and the broken inheritance and the bastard daughter sent away under a borrowed name. and she turned to her nephew at the end of it and asked him with the sweetest cruelty in all her 40 years of confidence whether he had known, when he opened his purse to the shop girl, that he was paying the debts of the man who had ruined his own mother. It was the cruelest naming of her yet, no longer murmured over a candle nor pressed in a polished private warning, but flung in public, hurled across a crowded room, and meant to brand a woman before the only world she had. Bastard. Impostor. The daughter of the family's destroyer come to feed on its grief. The room drew its breath in one motion and held it, and turned the whole gold weight of it to look at the plain green figure by the door. Esme stood in the held breath of the room, and understood 3 things at once, and all 3 of them broke over her like cold water poured slow. She understood whose daughter she was, which she had not known an hour before, which no one had ever told her, which her father, her false, careful father, had carried to his grave with the name Rayburn. She understood why a quiet man had come to a village with a child in a trunk, and no history, and where the money for the lease had first come from, and what the enamel locket with no portrait in it had always meant. And she understood, last and worst, the Earl's silence over the counter that afternoon, the mute mouth, the face that could not give an answer, because she understood now that he had known. He had known from the first morning. He had paid her debts, knowing. He had let her play his mother's song in the dark, knowing, and had said nothing. And his silence had not been a refusal at all, but a cage he had built around the truth to keep it from her, and the cage had just been thrown open by the cruelest hand in the room. She did not faint, she did not weep. She looked across the gold room at the Earl of Caldbeck, and what was in her face was not shame, though the room had assembled to put shame there. It was a question, the same question she had laid on no counter, the question of why he had not told her, and it was the worst thing he had ever seen, because he had built the cage himself, and called it mercy, and now he watched it fall on her, and he had perhaps 4 seconds in which to decide what kind of man he was. He had time in those 4 seconds to do the safe thing. The dowager had handed him the safe thing on a silver tongue. He had only to be silent again, to let the room's verdict stand, to allow the daughter of Sir Halford Mercer to be removed from his ballroom, and his life, and to marry Romilly Vauncey in the spring, and ride his boundary at dawn, and keep his mother's letter in a locked drawer, and never again feel the warm, dangerous thing the shop had grown in him. It was the wise course. It was the course his aunt had spent 40 correct years teaching him. The whole machinery of his rank was built to make it the easy course, and the room, holding its breath, expected it of him, because the room had never once seen the order of its world fail to win. He crossed the room. He crossed it in the held silence, past Lady Romilly and her grandmother's diamonds, past the fireplace and the staring families, the length of the gold ballroom in his navy coat. And he stopped in front of her at the door, and he did the thing his aunt had not foreseen because it had never once been done in front of her. He took off his right glove, the black glove the village had made a story of, and he held out his bare hand to the shopkeeper's daughter in front of the whole assembled county. And when she looked at the offered hand and did not understand it, he said the thing he had been unable to say in the warm shop, said it level and clear, and 12 words in the same gold arena, where the hierarchy had just rendered its verdict. He said, "Then I will marry Sir Halford's daughter, and gladly, before you all." The room did not breathe. The dowager's hand rose to her throat. And the Earl, who had crossed the room and could not now uncross it, turned to face the 40 nearest faces and did the rest of it, not in a long speech, because a man of his rank and his grief had no long speech in him, but in 3 short sentences that could not be taken back. He said that what his aunt had told them was true in every fact and false in every meaning. He said that the sins of Sir Halford Mercer were Sir Halford Mercer's dead these many years, and that the woman before them had been an infant, sent away in the dark, and had earned every shilling she had ever held with a hand finer than any in the room. He said that his own mother, who had borne the wound the dowager had just so pleasantly exhumed, had forgiven the man who dealt it in the hope that her son would not have to carry the grief, and that he chose, before them all, to spend that forgiveness as she had meant it spent, on the innocent daughter, and not against her. It was the minimum sufficient response, and not one word beyond it. He did not name his aunt's cruelty. He did not strip Lady Romilly before the room. He did not match the dowager's blow with a blow. He simply stepped between the daughter of his family's destroyer and the verdict that had been prepared for her, and let his own bare hand and his own name be the whole of his argument, and in the doing of it the room's held breath began, here and there, along the walls, to let go. Esme had not yet taken his hand. She stood with the truth of her whole life, broken open, at her feet, in front of 200 strangers, and she found that she had one thing left to do before she could decide whether to take a bare offered hand, and it was the thing her father, her false father, had taught her, without ever knowing what he was teaching her for. She let the silence sit, the ridden silence exact as a rest in music, and into it she said, not to the Earl but to the room, the clear copyist's voice that had never once betrayed fatigue, that she had not known until this hour whose daughter she was, that she had been raised by a man who kept a music shop and taught her that a debt is paid from the labor of one's own hands and not from another's purse, and that whatever blood she carried, the only inheritance she had ever wanted, was the one he gave her, which was a fine hand and a straight back, and the knowledge of which silences are written, and which are merely cowardice. Then she turned to the Earl, and she said, low, so that only the nearest heard it, that he ought to have told her, and that she would never again abide a silence he chose for her good. And then, before all of them, she took his bare hand in her gloved one. The Dowager Countess of Caldbeck stood by the great fireplace with her hand still at her throat, and understood, in a single short collapse of 40 correct years, that she had measured the field exactly wrong. She had brought the shopgirl to the ballroom to be shamed, and had instead built her a stage. She had counted on her nephew's silence, and had instead bought his voice. She had been confident, and her confidence had been correct everywhere she had ever stood. And it had just here, in her own ballroom, in front of the only people whose opinion she had ever respected, failed for the first time in her life. She did not rage. People of her durability do not rage. She inclined her head a fraction, the smallest gesture in the room, and in the inclining of it she conceded a thing she would never afterward speak of, which was that she had been wrong, and that the woman she had called a shopgirl had more dignity in a borrowed length of lace than the whole gold room had brought in its diamonds. It was a humbling, not a destruction. The Earl had been careful of that, and his mother's letter had been careful of it before him, and a man who matched cruelty with cruelty would have been no better than the thing he stood against. Lady Romilly Vauncey recovered first, as the clever always do. She had not loved the Earl, and so was not heartbroken, and she had never been refused, and so was, for one bright, cold instant, unable to comprehend that she had been. Then she comprehended it. Matte. She looked at the Earl's bare hand in the shop-girl's glove, and at the room beginning to turn here and there toward the couple by the door, and she made the only winning play left on a losing hand, which was to be the first to bless it. She crossed to them, the diamonds bright, and she wished them joy in a voice pitched for the room to hear, and in the wishing she salvaged her own dignity, and read, in a single, short, clear instant, the recognition that she had circled the wrong field, that worth was not a fortune, nor a profile, nor a place near the top of the order, but a thing a shopkeeper's daughter could carry into a gold room and make the room kneel to. She did not love it. She saw it. For Lady Romilly, who had been told her whole life she was the correct choice, the seeing was its own small private ruin, and it was also, the village would later agree, the beginning of her becoming a rather better woman than she had been. They were married at the parish church in Nethercote in the 3rd week of a wet March, with Mrs. Sowerby in the front pew in her own grandmother's lace, restored to her now that Esme had lace of her own. The Earl did not have a grand wedding. He had a quiet one, in the church, where Esme had been taught to read a score before a psalter, and the music was copied in her own fine hand and played by the people she had taught, and the song his mother had sung was played at the end of it, not because he could no longer bear to hear it, but because he found at last that he could. The dowager attended. She sat very straight and said little, and gave the bride a small wrapped thing afterward without explanation, which proved to be a sprig of the rosemary that grew along the south wall of the hall, dried and pressed and tied with thread. And Esme understood the gift and the apology folded inside it, and accepted both with a grace that cost the dowager nothing, and gave her back a little of what she had spent, which is the only kind of forgiveness that ever heals an old confident heart. There was the matter of the debt which Esme had sworn to repay by quarterly installments from the labor of her own hands. She did repay it, in a manner of speaking, though not as she had meant. On the morning after the wedding she put £412, exactly, drawn against her own new settlement, into the poor box of the Nethercote Church, and beside it a note in her fine hand directing that it be spent on the instruction of children whose fathers kept shops and could not pay for music. She told her husband she had discharged her debt to the memory of an honest man, and he understood that she meant her father, the false, careful man who had given her a name and a hand and a straight back, and he understood that some debts are paid forward because they cannot be paid back, and he did not argue because he had learned that winter daughters. The difference between a silence that is written and a silence that is only fear. She kept the music shop. She would not give it up, Earl's wife, or no. And the Earl, who had once subscribed to a library he had no need of in order to stand for a quarter of an hour in a warm room, did not ask her to. She set a young woman to keep the counter, and came down from the hall on Tuesdays and Thursdays to copy the difficult commissions herself, because a copyist's hand must never betray fatigue, and because a great house has many rooms, and not one of them had ever taught her what the little music shop had, which was that the world's verdict on a woman is not the final verdict, and that worth survives invisibility until the day someone who's seeing matters finally looks. On a Tuesday in the following autumn, a year almost to the week from the morning the bell had rung, and a man in a navy coat had stood counting the room, the Earl of Caldbeck came in out of the first hard frost, and found his wife at the counter with the better of her father's 2 violins out of its case. She did not look up at once. She finished the bar she was copying, set down her pen, and only then lifted her head, and saw him in the doorway with rain still bright on the shoulders of his coat. And she smiled, the slow smile. She gave no one else, and she took up the violin and played him the first measures of his mother's song before he had so much as crossed the threshold. He stood and let her play it. The frost held the lane. The fire was lit, and under the lace at her throat, warm against her skin where the village had once been unable to see it, the small enamel locket lay quiet. At last its painted forget-me-not no longer a question, but only a flower, kept for love and not for grief, in a room she had not had to leave to be, finally and before everyone's seen. If Esme's long winter moved you, stay a moment in the warm of it before you go, and carry with you the thing the shop taught her, that quiet dignity is never wasted, and is only, sometimes, waiting to be witnessed. Thank you for staying until the end.